Alright guys, here is the day-night tutorial. The artwork in this tutorial was done by a former MTSU student by the name of Savannah Harden. With her permission, I've created this tutorial outlining the process used to create this wonderful motion media effect within her piece. First up, let's set up our file in Photoshop. So, as always, when we're working in Photoshop, especially when we're planning to use a file for After Effects, it's important to stay organized. So name your layers, color coordinate. If you want any of your layers to be put into a separate pre-comp, you can put those layers into a folder within Photoshop. So the file I've provided is set up at 30 inches by 10 inches at 300 dpi. The portion of your illustration that'll be visible for the animation will only be 10 inches by 10 inches. So that extra 10 inches on the right and left of the piece is only for background elements like the sky and the background water. So for almost every element within this illustration, there is a daytime version and a nighttime version. And it'll be arranged back to back within our layers panel. So there are, of course, some examples where having this doubled up layer does not need to occur. So the stars and moons only exist during the nighttime, therefore they only have one layer. We'll move on to importing our PSD to After Effects. So let's click on New Composition. We can name our file. Width and height can be set at 3,000 pixels by 3,000 pixels with a frame rate of 25 seconds. And I'll set the duration to about 15 seconds. Then from our project panel, we'll drag and drop our layers into our timeline. Once our layers are imported, I start color coding to differentiate between the day and night scenes. I've made any border flower layers green because I know I'll be treating these differently than the other layers within this comp because they'll be there both for the day and night scenes. Now our composition has expanded to fit the size of our PSD composition. So we'll remedy this by editing our composition settings. So we'll change the width back down to 3,000 pixels. The first motion media we'll add is the rotation to the varying elements within the composition. So before adding the rotation, I'll first adjust the anchor points of each layer using the pan behind tool, and the hotkey for that is Y. Once the pan behind tool is selected, I'll click and drag the central anchor point to where I want the layer to rotate around. In this case, I'm bringing them to the bottom middle point on the composition. Then I'll change when the nighttime layers turn on within the timeline by dragging the layer bars to my desired starting point. Now let's add the rotation. So I'll start by selecting the layer, pressing R to open the rotation property. Then I'll bring the timeline indicator to where I want the motion to start. Now we'll press the stopwatch to enable keyframes for this property. Then I'll move the timeline indicator to where I want the motion to stop. I'll type in -180 to create a semicircle rotation, moving counterclockwise. So 2 keyframes have been created now, and we're creating movement. When we play it back, we see the rotation of this one layer. I'll continue this process for the remaining background day layers that'll be rotating out of the composition. I am staggering the starting and ending point of rotation for the different layers here. Now I'm going to change the rotation of the nighttime layers. We want these layers to start off of the composition and then move into it. So let's select the layer, press R to open the rotation property, adjust the timeline indicator to the starting point of the motion. Click the stopwatch to enable keyframes, then we'll type in 180. move the timeline indicator to the endpoint of the motion, and then type in 0. So 2 keyframes have been created. Again, this should create movement when we play it back. This rotation needs to be added to each background nighttime layer before moving on to the next step. Now we can see the basis of our rotation movement. Since there's so many layers that don't have movement yet, I'm going to isolate the layers that we've added movement to by pressing the soloing button in our timeline panel. Each layer that has this button pressed will be visible, while the other layers will be temporarily hidden. Now we can add the rotation of the layers back to their starting points. Select the layer, move the timeline indicator to the new starting point of the rotation, press the keyframe button, move the timeline indicator to the ending point of this new motion, then type in the rotation. The daytime layers will have the rotation changed to -1. Whereas the nighttime layers will have their motion changed to -180. After a few adjustments, this is what our base rotation looks like. Some of our layers will be rotating at the exact same time as our background daytime and nighttime layers. We could totally add this rotation individually, as we've done so far. But in an effort to save time, we can instead utilize the pick whip. I'll showcase this using the background tree layer. This layer will be following the rotation movement of the volcano. So I will open the rotation property for each of these layers. So the hotkey is R. Then I'll click and drag the pick whip from the tree layer to the volcano layer. When we look at the composition, we see the tree layer follows the exact motion of the volcano. Not only does this save time with setting up the motion up front, but it also saves you time if you make edits to the timing of this movement, because the tree layer will update with any changes made to the timing of the rotation movement from here on out. I continued repeating this process for all the layers that are meant to rotate for the day-night transition. And I did this utilizing the pick whip to add rotation to the corresponding layers. Let's see how it looks. So there are a few layers that I plan to have rotating, but not in this day-night transition. And this will use the same process, so let's get into it. The group of flowers that was in a folder in the PSD file was automatically put into a pre-comp in After Effects when we imported all of this. So we can double click this to open it up, and this will isolate the layers. First step will be to adjust the anchor point. So using the pan behind tool, again hotkey Y, I am moving these anchor points to the area of the layer where I want the rotation to be centered around. The movement for this rotation will be happening throughout the entirety of the animation. So we'll start the movement at the beginning of the timeline. I click the stopwatch to enable keyframes, then move the timeline indicator to the next point of rotation, adjust the rotation, then select the first keyframe, copy and paste it to the ending point of the movement. To keep this movement happening for the entire animation, we will enable keyframes expressions. So Alt-click or Option-click the stopwatch icon. Then type out loop out cycle. Check out that movement. This same process is repeated for the rest of the layers that we're adding rotation to within this pre-comp. And we'll return back to our main composition to see this movement in action. Let's add a bit of movement utilizing the position property. This will be pretty similar to our rotation movement. So first we'll select the appropriate layer and press hotkey P to open the position property. So once this is open, I press the stopwatch to enable keyframing. I'll move the timeline indicator to where I want the next point of the movement to be, and then I can click and drag the layer within the composition panel. Another keyframe is automatically created here. I will then copy and paste the first keyframe to the end point of this cycle of movement. So let's enable the loop out expression again with Alt-click or Option-click on the stopwatch icon. Then type out loop out cycle. The fish and turtle will also be moving with the position property. So I'll follow the same actions for the boat, except I won't add in the loop out expression at the end. The clouds will also create movement with the position property. I want this movement to only be horizontal. So in the moment that I'm dragging a layer within the composition panel, I can hold Shift to constrain the movement to its original horizontal axis. And this ensures that the object stays perfectly aligned with its starting position as it's moved across the screen. Since the rest of the cloud layers should have the same positional movement, I can utilize the pick whip to accomplish this pretty easily. Alright, we want a few of our layers to fade in and out. So first up is the cloud layers that we were just working on. So let's select a layer and press hotkey T for opacity. Change the opacity to 0 since we want the clouds to fade in. Then press the stopwatch to enable keyframing, move the timeline indicator, adjust the opacity to 100. Since we want the other cloud layer to fade in with the same timing, we can utilize the pick whip. I'll select the other cloud layers, press T for opacity, then drag the pick whip from the unchanged cloud layer to the edited one. Now that they'll all fade in together, let's make them fade out as we transition to night. Since we pick whipped some of our layers, we want to go back to our original cloud layer that we edited the opacity on. Move the timeline indicator to where we want the clouds to finish fading out and then type in 0. Then we move the timeline indicator to where we want them to start fading out, and then type in 100. We'll look at the composition panel and we'll see that all clouds are now following these new opacity keyframes. Another layer we want to adjust opacity on is our circular border. Once we're selecting the layers, press T for opacity. Click the stopwatch to enable keyframes, and this will create a keyframe at 100% where the timeline indicator is. Next, move the timeline indicator to where we want the top area to completely fade out. Then type in 0%. In watching the playback, notice how the turtle is still visible once it starts rotating out of frame. I'll go ahead and adjust the opacity to fade before it reaches the border. Next, we're going to work on changing the colors of our border flowers. To do this, we're going to add a color correction effect called hue saturation. So we can open the effects and presets, and then we'll search for hue saturation. Let's click and drag that effect to our flower pre-comp. The effect properties panel will open up on the left side of the screen. We can now click the stopwatch to enable keyframing for the channel range. Once we click this, a keyframe is created for the original color of the flowers. We'll move the timeline indicator to where we want the transition of color to be completed. And we can adjust the master hue. Notice how the colors are changing in the composition panel. Let's play it back. Now I can pick whip these hue saturation changes for our other border flower pre-comp. Then we'll adjust the color back to the original for the transition back to day. I'll copy the last keyframe we created, move the timeline indicator to where the transition starts, and then I'll paste the keyframe. Then we'll move the timeline indicator to where the transition stops. From there, copy and paste the original keyframe. Let's watch it back. We're going to add a wave warp effect to a few of our layers to add somewhat of a rippling effect. We'll start by looking at the bubbles. So we'll open the effects and presets. Then search for wave warp. Click and drag the effect onto the layer. We can click on the down arrow by the wave warp effect to showcase all of the different keyframeable properties. Or we can adjust these in the effect properties panel. Since this movement will be happening for the entire animation, we don't have to utilize any keyframes. Any adjustments we make with the warp effect will automatically transpire throughout the animation. I'm experimenting with the different qualities of the effect until it looks right to me. The nighttime bubbles are going to follow the same exact motion, so we can quickly pick whip any of the qualities from our wave warp effect from our daytime bubble layer. I'll add the wave warp effect the same exact way to the top smoke area of the volcano. And I'm just making a few adjustments along the way. The playback's a little choppy, but the movement is there. After adding the warp effect, I realized the moon layer hadn't been given its rotation movement yet. So to do this, we'll select the moon layer, press hotkey R to open rotation, and I'm leaving the anchor point in the middle of the layer because the moon will be rotating around this point. I'll move the timeline indicator to where I want the rotation to start. I'll adjust the degree of rotation, move the timeline indicator to where the moon will pause in the sky for a short period, and then we'll adjust the degree of the rotation again. Then I'll move the timeline indicator to where I want the next moment of rotation to start. So copy and paste the last keyframe, and finally we'll move the timeline indicator to the endpoint of the rotation movement. And then we'll adjust the degree of rotation until the moon is out of the sky. To add a linear wipe effect, we'll open the effects and presets, then search for linear wipe. I'll click and drag this onto the rainbow layer. So notice there's already 2 keyframes added for this effect. I'll make a few adjustments with the wipe angle and adjust the timing by moving the keyframes. The last effect we're adding is the opacity flash effect. We'll open the effects and presets, then we'll search for opacity flash. I'll click and drag the opacity flash random onto the lava layer. This layer lives inside of the volcano pre-comp. Let's see how it looks within our main composition. Let's add some music. Find your music file, then click and drag into the timeline layers panel. Make any adjustments to timing that are necessary. Before rendering, make any additional adjustments that you might want for your animation. I slightly adjusted the timing of some of the motion components, and I also added some easy ease to a few motion components as well. So once everything is solid, it's time to render. So go to File, Composition. You can add to Adobe Media Encoder from here. I've decided to just add to the render queue within After Effects. And I'm keeping all of the pre-populated settings. So I'm rendering as an H.264 file, which is the most widely used video compression standard that'll create an MP4 file. And then we need to select where the file will be saved by clicking Output To, and then rename the file if you'd like at this point. So you press render, and then let's see our final result.